William, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here.
Well, just before we get into it, for everyone listening that hasn't come across you and your work, could you just give us a brief introduction?
Well, you contacted me because you're interested in my ideas about evolutionary psychology and narrative and why we get so absorbed in stories, emotionally absorbed and fascinated and anxious to know what's going to happen next. Stephen King, in his novel Misery,
Mhm.
describes what he calls the gotta, the Gotta. And what he says the gotta is when someone is reading a book and they're supposed to go to sleep and their spouse says, "Come to bed now." And the person says, "Oh, I will in 20 minutes, but I gotta find out what happens next."
That's awesome.
So it's not as though you can't wait till the next day to find out what happens next. Nothing else is happening, but somehow we get sufficiently absorbed, wrapped up in, lost in the anxiety of what's going to happen in a story that we can't put it down. And I was, for a very long time, interested in a question in film, which is how can we be absorbed in film when the very fact that we're seeing what that we're seeing things that are not being seen in that world.
Mm.
Why isn't the fact that we can see these things proof that they're not really going on and sufficient proof that they're not really going on that we wouldn't be on the edge of our seats? The very fact that we're in seats means that we're not in this I don't know, bedroom where these two people are having a fight, or this place where people are doing a walkabout, um, uh, um, as in the Peter Weir movie. The very fact that we're sitting there watching means it can't be happening, and yet we forget that we're there and we just get absorbed by what we're watching. So
Mm.
years ago, I sort of evolved a psychoanalytic theory about that, which I don't think is wrong. But that the idea is something like this, and it's just very mildly psychoanalytic, a little bit more from Melanie Klein than from Freud. But the idea is mildly like this, that the times and periods in our life where we are really anxious about what other people are doing, but forget that we're even there as we watch what they're doing, is most frequently when we're very concerned about a drama that's playing out between our elders, in particular our parents.
Mm.
So there's a kind of return to childhood anxiety about what will happen. Will there be a disaster? Will things work out or not? And we're watching it, but we're nobody. We're just so small and so insignificant. So we believe at that age. And so our significance doesn't do anything, doesn't disturb our sense that we're not there, or not having a sense that we are there is a better way to put it,
Right.
as we get absorbed by what is going on between these larger than our life characters, our parents, our grandparents, the adults, perhaps our older siblings, whoever they are. And I also, for other reasons, was got interested in the anthropology of gift giving. And Marcel Mauss has a famous book called The Gift. And in The Gift, he describes a cultural universal, which is the practice of gift giving, which seems counter to, he says, is counter to, let's call it the Marxist idea, or any idea that barter comes first and then credit and debt come after the original idea of barter. And he says, no, it seems to be a cultural universal that people give gifts to others, but expect that they will get gifts in return, but that expectation is never made explicit.
Mm.
So it is an unconscious or an unspelled out expectation, But in any economy of gift giving, gifts go one way for a while and then they go the other way. And then I was reading, I've always been interested in evolutionary psychology, and I came upon a book called The Evolution of Cooperation, and also another book by the Sahavis, who are ornithologists, called The Handicap Principle. And those books are about how human cooperation might have evolved. And there was an older story about the evolution of human cooperation that it's essentially tit for tat. That is, that if I can save your life with very little danger to mine, then you will do the same for me if we evolve to do that. If I can help someone without that costing me very much, then some later date that person can help me without it costing them very much. And this is a sort of very basic game theory idea of evolutionary psychology. And there are other theories of evolutionary psychology that have to do that are connected to it, but have to do with what's called the selfish gene, Richard Dawkins's term, where the famous line that Hamilton came up with, I believe it was, it's actually a little bit hard to figure out who actually said this, but the famous line is, "I would give up my life for two siblings or eight cousins." The idea being that the genes that two siblings possess are each has roughly half of my genes, and so two of them will work out to about the same number of the same genes as I do, and eight cousins will work out to the same number of the same genes that I have. So giving up my life for them is my genes making sure that they are, since genes are in a sense purely information, that information is preserved. Obviously, they're not purely information, but as far as motivation and incentive goes, it's as though they're information. And as long as a gene can be sure that a copy of that gene is preserved, then it will selfishly cause me to do whatever will make it possible to preserve that gene. But then I got really interested reading the handicap principle in altruism, and in true altruism rather than altruism, something that looks like altruism, but which is actually a function of what genes are programming me to do. So the genes would be like the original AIs, and I would be the original person being manipulated by an AI, because they would be artificially intelligent. They're not really thinking, they're not really selfish, but they're doing, you could call them not large language models, but large nucleic acid models. And but the idea in the handicap principle is that, and this comes out of evolutionary psychology, or well, yeah, it comes out of evolutionary psychology, as it's called, in evolutionary game theory. And the idea in the handicap principle is that if you look at the example that's always used, and it goes all the way back to Darwin, is look at the peacock. So a peacock's tail is ridiculous from any theory of pure survival. A peacock's tail is going to make the peacock very noticeable to predators. Peacocks get their tails entangled in scrub and bushes, and then they can't get away. A lot of energy goes into producing and maintaining that tail. And it's simply not clear why a peacock should have a tail like that. The same is true of many, many, many things that animals display. Flamingos, for example, are pink because they are eating toxins that are not good for them, but they actively seek out those toxins because those toxins will turn them pink. So peacock has a tail that makes its life harder. a flamingo eats toxins that makes its life harder. Why do they do that? So the answer seems to be, and it was an answer that I was primed to receive because of the work that I'd done on gift giving and the altruism or apparent altruism of gift giving. The answer seems to be that these are what are called costly signals. Darwin thought the answer was, and I'm not saying this is wrong, I'm saying this is a better way of describing what he's saying, but Darwin thought the answer was that in fact we seem to have, or many animals seem to have an innate appreciation of beauty. And so you see something beautiful and you appreciate it, and therefore you might nature for some reason makes us appreciate beauty and makes us produce beautiful things. And in sexual selection, which is what Darwin was talking about, he was the person who came up with the idea of sexual selection as part of evolution. In sexual selection, the choosers in birds, usually females, in very frequently females, but not always, the choosers are selecting the objects of choice that strike them as most beautiful. And Darwin just thought there seems to be an innate attraction to beauty. But the idea of costly signaling is also known as honest signaling. So honest signaling means that you can't produce something. You can't produce a pink legs if you're and pink skin if you're a flamingo without actually consuming the poison. There's no shortcut around it. You can't produce a peacock's tail without actually putting a lot of energy into it. So the idea of costly signaling is that it's a mating strategy, and what the costly signaler is doing is essentially boasting about how much it can afford. This tail. The upkeep is a lot. It's a version again in the sort of Mosian or Veblenian idea of conspicuous consumption. So it is expensive to be conspicuous, and so if you are conspicuous, it means you can afford it. And if you can afford it, then the choosers, and just for the sake of ease of argument, it will always depend on the specifics of any particular species, specifics of a species, almost
It's a
tautological.
tough one, yeah.
But it will depend on the specifics of any specific species. But the idea would be that the female choosing a male who can afford to be overdoing it, to be doing things that are not in fact helping him survive, but in fact may cut into the likelihood of his survival. And yet he can do it because he's so fit, because he has so much extra energy, because again, for conspicuous consumption in humans, you can light your cigar with a banknote because you have so many banknotes, and what's one more or less. So the peacock can have this beautiful tail because it has enough reserves to survive having this stupid thing, which is making it conspicuous and threatening some entanglement, but it can shrug that off.
Mm.
And so the female, the peahen, thinks without thinking, but it's sort of this game theoretical thinking, just the way the genes are thinking. So is the peahen thinking. That male is attractive because it can afford what many males cannot. And so that means it's fit and will be more likely to give me fit offspring than males who can't do that, or who do less of that. And then there's also a kind of self-sustaining quality to it. Again, these are not my ideas. These are ideas in evolutionary psychology. There's a self-sustaining aspect of that, which is, and I am likely, therefore, my offspring, our offspring, are likely to have the same fitness and to be able to produce the same signals of fitness that this peacock just did. And so my offspring will also be likely to do well in a competition to reproduce. And in a sense, I am picking this peacock not so much for my offspring as for their offspring. So kind of directed towards grandchildren, grandbirds, whatever you want to call them,
Right.
rather than the immediate offspring. It's where the immediate offspring are going to be when it's time for them to mate. So there are lots of possible costly signals. I'll stop ranting in a second, but there are lots of possible costly signals. And one kind of costly signal would be you show, so let's just anthropomorphize here, although we shouldn't because humans are different in a lot of ways. But you show, so I'm not going to anthropomorphize, just cut that part out. What you show is that you can eat poison and still strut around, or you can have this tail and it doesn't make you any weaker than those you're competing with who can't afford to have such a tail, and so on. And there are lots of different costly signals. And most of them come at a net cost, you could say, to the species. Because in any synchronic moment, more members of the species would die than would have to.
Right.
But at a net gain for for any individual who can pick the fittest offspring. But there's one kind of costly signaling that doesn't come at a net cost to the species. And that seems to be something that pretty much only humans do. And that's what is called altruistic punishment.
Yep.
So it's altruism. The costly signal is altruism. You are giving more than you get. You're giving a lot to charity. And what do you get for giving a lot to charity? Your name is in the program, or your name is posted on the internet. Is it really worth $1 million for you to be listed as $1 million giver? Probably not. But it's not like you get nothing out of it. You get something. Adam Smith, actually, as in so much else, he anticipated a lot of these ideas in his book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And he explicitly said that people, yes, they got a lot of good feeling for being unselfish, but the good feeling they got was ultimately worth less than their unselfishness cost them. So human altruism is a costly signal. That's how the theory goes. Any kind of human altruism is a costly signal. But there's a particular kind of altruism that we humans are really interested in, which is altruistic punishment. And what altruistic punishment is if you see someone cheating, but they're not cheating you, it's so what? It's mildly unfortunate, but you go about your business. You see someone being mugged on the street, but they're across the street, and you don't intervene because why should you put yourself at risk? It doesn't even occur to you to intervene. That would be the theory of the selfish gene. That you don't intervene. And the selfish gene theory would say, okay, but you might intervene because if you save this person who is about to be murdered, they might save you at some time in the future. But what about the murderers? They're not going to help you in the future. So that doesn't quite work. But the theory of altruistic punishment is that altruistic punishers are particularly sending out a particularly costly signal. which is they are doing something that in the first instance, they put themselves at risk for no obvious benefit. And the result of that is it's a costly signal. They do get admired, so there is a benefit if it leads to reproductive success.
Mm.
As a friend of mine who um, works on ants and ant colonies, the thing that she hates most among her biological colleagues is when they go out and do field work and they talk about who gets more copulations. But the idea would be if the altruistic punisher survives, he again, this is gonna I'm gonna give the simplified male version. He will get more copulations.
Mm-hmm.
But do you really want to risk your life to get more copulations? Well, you might, and now we're a little bit back to the selfish gene, if it's going to give you more offspring, but it still has to be, as far as you're concerned, look like genuine altruism. And I'm
Yes.
going to say looking like genuine altruism is altruism. And so we evolved, this is the argument, humans evolved in such a way that we are really interested in altruistic punishers. We find them very, very attractive. That was something that happened by chance, although evolution would then have strengthened it. But it could have been that what we would find attractive instead is someone who was double jointed, and then you would quickly have a population of double jointed people. But being double jointed might not be of any actual advantage. That's probably a bad example because it probably is, but not enough that we are all double jointed.
Right.
So the but altruistic punishing does give people an advantage, gives a society an advantage because it means that those who want to be free riders or cheaters won't be able to free ride because others are going to intervene, even though that intervention does them no good at all.
Mm.
In the first instance, it does them no good at all. The good it does do them, but this is only after through whatever random evolutionary process they become interveners. It only does them some good when people who witness that turn out to admire it, understand it, again, their genes understand it, to be costly and therefore admirable. And so there then becomes a kind of self-sustaining aspect to evolution where we feel more and more admiration for altruists and for altruistic punishers. We get more and more interested in what defections they're punishing. So if you have an altruistic punisher, it means that that person is punishing someone who deserves punishment. And why would they deserve punishment? Well, it would be that they are acting the opposite of altruistically. So altruism becomes an admired trait in humans, as it almost entirely, I'm not going to say it's absolutely not admired by other animals in their own species, but humans really admire altruism. And so the question is, so what are the altruists? What is the punishment that they are meting out? Who are they punishing? And they're punishing the non-altruists. That is to say, those who are selfish and playing for themselves. And how do the non-altruists most vividly and emotionally manifest that? It's by cheating the helpless.
Mm.
So again, this is a very simple idea, but there are those who are helpless in one way or another. They're children, they're whatever. They are helpless in one way or another. They're naive. They are unaware of a situation. and a cheater comes and cheats them in some way, and the altruistic punisher witnesses this and says no and intervenes. And we, the audience, so we're sort of a fourth party in this four-layered structure, admire the altruistic punisher. We are very interested in what that punisher is doing and why, and whether the punishment is appropriate. That is, there's a whole lot of things that go into making it the appropriate thing to do. It can't just be someone, you insulted me, so I'm going to punch you in the face.
Right.
Then it's punishment, but it's not altruistic,
Hmm.
and it's selfish, and it is also it's a signal of bad judgment, which is not something that we admire. But the altruistic punisher says, "Leave that kid alone," and the bully says, "Why don't you mind your own business?" And the altruistic punisher says, "I'm going to make it my business." We who are observing this will admire the altruistic punisher for protecting the helpless person from the selfish bully.
Hmm.
And we evolved to pay very close attention to punishment and to the appropriateness of punishment, because all animals cheat when they can, but humans actually cheat a whole lot less than any other animals, believe it or not. And it's a little bit hard to believe, maybe given the US election um, season that we're in.
Fair enough.
But humans cheat a lot less than other animals because usually when they cheat, they don't get away with it. Now, some do, but the usual thing is that there's a kind of self-sustaining structure. And part of that self-sustaining structure, and so here's a kind of fifth level, is I told you I'd give you a very fast version of this, so I
Great. No, I
didn't.
love it.
But the fifth version of this is that our paying attention, we pay attention in the same way the altruistic punisher pays attention. We don't intervene, but our attention is also um, requires some expenditure of energy that we could put into something else, like cheating someone. But we pay attention. Our attention is what the kind of second order or nth order reward to the altruistic punisher is, because some of the attention payers will then get involved erotically with the altruistic punisher. But we just have to be structured to give our attention to that punisher, to root for, to care for that punisher, to be on that punisher's side. And that attention is something that we are programmed to be alert, or we're programmed to be alert to this sort of thing all the time. We really like observing it. So what fiction does, what movies do, is they give us the kind of thing that we are programmed to be alert to, not for survival reasons. That is, I don't need to know that I'm just trying to I used Oliver Twist as an example in my book. But I don't need to know that the hero of some novel has punished the villain of that novel when it has nothing to do with my life. I just don't need to know that. But I'm really interested in knowing it because we have evolved to pay attention and to like paying attention
Yeah.
to altruistic punishment. If we didn't like paying attention to it, then altruistic punishment would disappear because it would no longer be received as the costly signal that it is. But because we've evolved to like paying attention, altruistic punishment survives. It means that humans cooperate with unrelated humans, unlike ants or bees that are essentially paying very close attention to how many genes those they're helping they have in common with. And with ants or bees, it can be three-quarters of the genes. But we are just interested in what is much more social rather than genetic than the kind of cooperation you get among the social insects, which is completely explainable through genetic, as far as I know, and I know something about this, through genetic analysis. But human behavior isn't, although people try. But the idea of costly signaling works. So just to turn this all around, and then I'll stop.
No,
Um,
it's beautiful.
uh,
Get it.
One thing that I conceive of myself doing is using what I feel that I am really good at uh, intuiting and understanding, which is literary experience. I really know what it's like to get to that gotta moment. I know what it's like um, to take a very minor example, to care whether a poem rhymes or not, which for various reasons I think is part of the same um, dynamic. Um, and um, so what I am trying to do is to support this theory of the evolution of cooperation by saying, yes, I can tell you that that's how literature works, and literature is actually really good evidence. Oh, you scientists who never read a word of literature, let me just punish you a little bit for that. Um, but that literature is really good evidence for this theory of the evolution of cooperation via costly signaling and altruistic punishment. Okay, I'll zip it.
No, I mean, God, William, there are so many questions that I have based upon that. That's why I really wanted you to come on the show. I think one of the things, just the recency effect as an example. You mentioned poetry, and I know you've got your background in arts and the poetry. It's probably my favorite poem is "Home Burial" by Robert Frost.
Yes.
And one of the things that you had me thinking there was that there is this sort of dynamic that goes on between the husband and the wife, where the husband has been able to sort of detach himself from having to bury his son, but in so doing it is having a cost, right? What do you think's going on there? Just out of interest, I'd love your thoughts on that.
Well, so that's the one where home is something that you haven't to deserve, right? Oh, no, no, I'm sorry. That's the death of the hired man. No,
Yeah,
I'm
so
confused.
she's standing at the top of the staircase and she's looking out at the graveyard where, her son is buried, and he comes
Yeah,
in and the shovels in the just like, how dare you do this? There's this really, because I work in relationships and existentialism as a therapist. There's this beautiful dynamic between like reconciling that tension between having to move on with your life whilst grieving, and also being able to feel enough, without leading to rumination and obsession and sort of spending all your time in the past. I, he captured that so well, and I see that interplay all the time when I'm working with people who are grieving for their children. It always brings a tear to my eye when I read that poem. And the reason
yeah,
why I
yeah,
would love your thoughts on that is because there seems to be this really interesting scenario where the husband is doing the thing that no one wants to do. No one wants to bury their son, especially the wife. And she's angry at him for not for from her perspective, not caring enough. But yet
yeah.
at the same time, when you're reading the poem, it's very justified. I can't hate the husband for doing that. So there seems to be this interesting sort of altruistic punishment thing going on even within that poem.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And so I'll just tell you that the sequel that I've been writing since this book came out, and that I have now written three first drafts of, because I couldn't bear to read my first draft, so I wrote a second first draft, and I couldn't bear to read that. So now I'm almost done with the third first draft, which I hope I'll be able to read when it's done. But what a lot of the sequel is about is what the effect of mourning is, why humans mourn. And it's not only humans who mourn, but wow, do we mourn more than other animals. And the question is, what does that do? And I'm taking mourning as a kind of gold standard for a certain kind of emotional attitude, which is um, uh, can't help with the thing that's being mourned. Thomas Gray has that famous line on the sonnet on the death of Richard West, where he says that I I'm not going to get the line exactly right, but I think it's the last line of the sonnet. It's either I mourn the more because I mourn in vain, but I think it's I grieve the more
Mm,
because I grieve in vain. So, there is something that an efficient evolutionist, that is, everything is for a purpose.
right.
Um, if you're grieving in vain, the result should be that you should grieve less.
Yes.
If you are doing the past cure is past care, to quote Shakespeare. But what Gray is saying is no, the very fact that grieving doesn't do any good increases the intensity of grieving. So, that gets us a little bit into existentialist territory, right?
Sure. Sure.
And um, so why is that? And so one of the things, so home burial would belong to this, but I'm also writing about, I mean, I write about, well, I'm also writing about Wordsworth's sonnet, Surprised by Joy.
Mm,
And what happens in that sonnet is Wordsworth um, has a moment of joy and he says, I turn to share the transport. Oh, with whom but thee? And he turns to share the transport with his daughter. And then he remembers she's dead, that she's died.
mm.
And so he feels joy because for a moment he's forgotten that she's dead. The joy that he feels makes him turn to say, hey, joy, but no, she's dead. And then he says, that was the worst pang that sorrow ever bore, save one only, when I knew that my heart's treasure was no more.
Wow.
So it's as though she died again
Yes.
when he turned to share the transport. And so, why do we do that? So, the Freudian theory of mourning, which again, I don't think is wrong, is that we use an enormous amount of psychic energy to bring the dead person back, to produce a phantom of the dead person as though they're not dead. Freud tells of a famous dream. It's not a dream a patient of his had, but a patient told him about this dream that she had heard about. The dream of the burning child, it's called.
Okay.
Freud calls it. And in the dream, father falls asleep. He's been watching over his dead son, who is about to be buried. And there's an old man who's also supposed to be watching over him. So he goes into the next room just to rest from this terrible, he's exhausted. He's prostrate. And then he falls asleep and he dreams of his child, who comes to him in the dream and says, Father, can't you see that I am burning? And then he wakes up, and what's happened is the old man has fallen asleep and a candle has fallen on the corpse.
Wow.
But he's somehow aware of that in his sleep. But the way he becomes aware of it is that he brings the child back to life for the child to say, I'm dead. But even if the child can say, I'm dead, that's something.
Mhm.
And so I think mourning, a lot of mourning, it takes the form of using a kind of emotional willpower to bring the dead back. And it doesn't last. It's painful, but as Faulkner very famously said, between nothing and grief,
Mhm.
I will take grief, which
Mm.
is a human attitude,
Right.
that you would prefer grief to nothing, like the mother in home burial.
Right.
And the but part of the idea is, why would you write a poem about grief? What is the um, public aspect of mourning? And I
Mm.
think that what it has to do, so this is just going to sound so different from what I'm just saying, but it's grief that I'm interested in and not this explanation that I'm about to give. But it's the same kind of um, emotional. So actually, a lot of this second book is um, inspired by Sartre's little book on the emotions.
Hmm.
And Sartre calls emotions magical thinking, that when you have an emotion, you are trying to get someone else to feel the way you're feeling. So
Right.
it's a kind of non-causal act of willing, where the more intensely you feel an emotion, the more part of that feeling is a feeling that someone else should be feeling it as well and will be feeling it. And who that someone else is can be the lost person. But if you grieve with enough intensity, that intensity um, feels like a promise to bring them back. So that even though Wordsworth says, I turn to share the transport, oh, with whom but thee, but there's no thee there for him to say that to. And yet, even the guilt and the self castigation that he's submitting himself to for turning to a person not there is expressed in an address to that person. So I think that goes all the way back to Orpheus and Eurydice. That is, it's Orpheus. Wordsworth is thinking of Orpheus turning to look at Eurydice. Is she there? And she's not.
Mm.
Um, and the the expressive need to somehow through emotional expression to uh, cause something to happen that you can't cause. Okay, now here's the part where it gets dry and wait a second, this is an anticlimax, but it's how we solve prisoner's dilemma. So the idea in prisoner's dilemma is you have two choices, someone else has two choices. If you both choose unselfishly, you will the two of you will come out better than if you both choose selfishly. However, if you choose selfishly and the other person chooses unselfishly, you'll come out even better, but the other person will come out really badly. So prisoner's dilemma is sort of the baseline. It's like the hydrogen atom of cooperation. How can you cooperate with someone whom who isn't even there with you, is in another cell? How can you cooperate with them if they know that they will always do better if they choose selfishly than if they choose unselfishly? If they choose selfishly and you choose selfishly, you'll both get 2 years in prison. If they choose if they choose selfishly and you choose unselfishly, they'll be freed and you'll get 10 years in prison.
Mm,
If
mm.
you both choose selfishly, you'll both get 1 year in prison. So just on your own, it is much better for you to be selfish. But what we tend to do in Prisoner's Dilemma, and don't take my word, this is there was a wonderful game show called Golden Balls. I don't know whether it made it to Australia, but you can
I don't
find it
remember it.
on YouTube. So what happens is this is how the finals work, and it's definitely worth seeing it on YouTube. Um, there are two contestants who are left in the finals, and there is a pot between them, and there's just this money between them, and they can now make a hidden choice so the other contestant doesn't know what they're going to do. They're going to reveal their choices at the same time, but they'll make the choice first, which is that, let's say there are, since it's a British show, it's in pounds, let's say there are 10,000 pounds in the pot in front of them, and each of them can decide whether to split the pot or to steal the pot. So that's the final round. And if they both split, then each will get 5,000 pounds.
Hmm.
If one steals and the other splits, the person who steals will get 10,000 pounds. If they both steal, neither of them will get anything. So,
Okay.
so that's a slight simplification of Prisoner's Dilemma, but a simplification that doesn't matter. That's
Right.
Prisoner's Dilemma. So logically, you should steal if you're being selfish, because the best case scenario is you get everything if the other person splits. And if the other person steals, you weren't going to get anything anyhow. So logically, you should steal if you're being greedy, and so should the other person.
Hmm.
So again, if an AI is doing it, see, I seem to have AIs on my mind, but if an AI is doing it, that would be the analysis it would do, and it would steal. And there is no way that splitting, if you're playing the game just once, you're not getting a reputation. It's not that people will come to think of you as an honest player of golden balls. You're on the TV show once. There's a lot of money there, and you have a chance for 10,000. You also have a chance for 5,000, but if you do what's going to get you 5,000, you could have gotten the 10,000 if you'd done the opposite. So
Yeah.
everything says you should steal. So what happens is the two contestants, just before they make their decision and put it in, they hide the decision so that they're revealed at the same time. They talk to each other for a minute, and each tries to convince the other, yes, you know, I'm my friends, all, you know, I've been an honest person. My father told me when I was a little girl that you always have to treat other people right. And I'm really, really going to do that. And I just really hope you believe me. And there's no surprise in what they say to each other. They speak very earnestly and emotionally to each other, to each trying to convince the other to
Yes.
split.
Which in itself creates a sort of distrust. You know, when you're trying to convince and prove to something, it's like, oh, I don't know who this person is.
Often, yes, exactly. But the more the more emotion you can actually feel in golden balls. So it's when you're actually feeling it rather than acting it out, the more likely that there will be a kind of magical thinking effect in the other person. That
Mm.
is, that they'll respond to your emotion, um, and that they will then, if they feel emotionally similar, they too will hope that by really intensely wanting to split, wow, would I like to split this with you? We would be so happy if we succeeded in doing that. And the more you can feel that, the more you have evidence that it's possible to feel that.
Yes.
And that therefore the other person might very possibly be feeling the same thing. And so you can gin up the emotion in yourself as a way of achieving a possibility of cooperation. The emotion itself is altruistic, the way
Mm.
the emotions of mourning are altruistic. You know, mourning may seem selfish, you know, get over it, which is maybe the husband. Um, but mourning isn't, whatever it is, it's not selfish. It is giving your peace of mind and your mental energy and your hope for stability. And you're not guarding that. You
Mm.
are
Mm.
using this immense energy to make yourself feel sad, to make yourself
Mm.
feel bad. It's not, I grieve the less because I grieve in vain. So what's the point of grieving? It's, I grieve the more because I grieve in vain.
Mm.
And the very fact that you're doing that is a kind of, it's a place where magical thinking and altruism go together. You
Right.
know, the rational part of you knows it's magical thinking. And that's what makes it all the more altruistic that you're grieving.
Mm.
And so in golden balls, it's magical thinking. It's not grief unless you blow it and lose the pot.
Right.
But it's not grief, but it does have to do with trust. How can I make myself really believe that I can trust you? Um, well, the very fact that I'm trying to do that is a kind of evidence that you might be trying to do the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
more intensely I want to trust you, the more evidence that I have, a kind of self ratifying evidence, the more evidence I have that you are um, um, doing the same thing.
Right. It's sort of a
And
priori in my actions as a consequence of
right,
me trying to actually get this across.
beautiful. Yeah, exactly. Um, so um, so I think that, if you ask why do we like sad stories, it's because, again, for altruistic reasons, here again I'm simplifying, but for altruistic reasons,
Yeah.
mourning, which is painful, is also something that we have evolved to engage in the altruistic act of.
Yes. Yes.
Um,
That makes so
and
much sense.
yeah,
It's
so
no, it's great, William. So let me bring you back to this idea of narrative, right? And comeuppance, and I think is the name of the book, obviously. So
yes,
this
yeah,
idea of altruistic punishment, whenever we're reading, a great book, or as Joseph Campbell would call the monomyth, the hero's tale, that every hero has some of these qualities that we've been discussing today. This idea of it's bad for me, but I'm going to do it for others. That we really seem to be very attentive toward. And the ultimate the ultimate act of costly singling, I suppose, is dying for others. That's why
yes,
we
yeah.
revere people who go to war and things like that. What so if we're thinking along those lines, you mentioned before that we as mammals, we have higher cortical areas of the brain, so we're very different to other mammals. When you're trying to navigate that line between it, so hang on, let me see if I can ask this in the way that I want to get it across. When someone is acting as a hero, you'll hear a lot of them say that it's just what I would do. They sort of bring it down, which is quite Australian as well. The tall poppy gets cut.
Right.
But are they, is it going on within them that they're trying to think of like how much of myself can I give whilst also still preserving a part of myself at the same time?
So I would say that that's not a conscious calculation, but it has to be part of the structure. Um, but it also means that there aren't hard and fast rules. Um, but again, if you the point I think is that um, you're you're always taking a risk. You're putting yourself at risk to be an altruist in this way.
Right.
Um, so it becomes probabilistic rather than there's a sharp line that's drawn. Yeah, maybe um, even if you're definitely going to die, you give up your life for your friend. Um, it is still continuous with other acts of altruism.
Mm.
And it's not the case, I don't think, that there is a hard and fast border this far and no farther as far as altruism goes. It's we're disposed to it, and there are going to be cases where that disposition is going to lead to inevitable disaster.
Mm.
But it's part of our characters. It's not, it's a disposition rather than a calculation.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Now, I know I've got to get you out of here, William, but there's so many things I want to ask you. So we'll have to get you back on the show at some point. I think
I'd
it'd
love that. Sure.
be fantastic. The final question I have to ask you is, what do you think lies at the bottom of every good story, based upon how you've converged a lot of different domains to understand narrative, evolutionary psychology and philosophy, to name a few, anthropology, the really great stories, the ones that we revere, Dostoevsky, a Stephen King, or maybe some commonalities in a Marvel movie that seem to just kill it at the box office. What are some of the deep things there that we all love?
So, well, I think that we um, like I'm thinking of something that Philip Roth said about what his novels are about, and he says they are always about people in trouble.
Mm,
Um, and I think that is what makes the story interesting is people in trouble. And who's in trouble? It doesn't have to be that what I say in Comeuppance, so just to explain the title, Comeuppance is an Americanism, I believe,
Yeah.
for you're getting your just desserts when you thought you were going to get away with something.
Yes. Yes. Get what you
But
deserve.
instead, you get what you should, what's coming to you.
Hmm.
Um, but so in Comeuppance, what I suggest, and this is maybe Joseph, the sort of thing that Campbell or people who study folk tales or fairy tales might say, is that there is, as I said before, there is an innocent, let's say Hansel and Gretel, who um, is being unfairly treated by someone with power. But the person with power who is acting unfairly is going to get punished for their unfair action. And, Hansel and Gretel may not be the best example because they take things into their own hands, but that's okay. Or Little Red Riding Hood. I don't know if that's what you call it in Australia. It might be Little Red Cap or something. But at any
Oh,
rate,
yeah, yeah. Red Riding Hood. Yep.
so she's an innocent. There is the treacherous wolf, and then there is the woodsman who punishes the wolf and frees Little Red Riding Hood.
Yes.
So in that case, what you have is an innocent, a defector, as I call such a character, that is a cheater, who is trying to cheat the innocent, and then a punisher who will punish the cheater for what the cheater does to the innocent. But it's the important thing is that it's someone in trouble. In that structure, it's the innocent who's in trouble, and uh, and an attempt to get out of that trouble um, without engaging in means that are too immoral. So, someone's in trouble, but they can decide um, uh, to lie and blame someone else for a crime that that person didn't commit, and then that person is executed. Um, the person in trouble is, we no longer feel any protective towards. We no longer want the person in trouble protected. But if the person in trouble really is having more trouble than they should be, an unfair amount of trouble,
Mm.
then we're interested in the story.
Yes.
And the ultimate altruistic punisher, we could say, or the ultimate altruist, is the what I call, following Trollope, the fictionist. So I think it's really important for us the storyteller is very important to us. Lots of stories are anonymous, and it's wrong to say, for example, that there was a Homer who composed the Iliad, but we still want there to be a Homer.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I'm a really big believer in naive responses to literature. And if Homer is just a collection of tales, well, at least I want the singer who brought them all together. That will be the fictionist for me. But
Right.
someone who is telling a story, because telling on someone and on what they did wrong, that's also punishment. And so
Yes.
someone who is telling a story and saying, here is the really bad thing that Achilles did. But then here is, going back to mourning, here is the act of mourning that he then undertook, and here is the sorrow that he felt when he saw his enemy's father, and he then let him go. Um, all of those are stories where, on some level, the fact that we can, let's say, trust the moral judgment of the teller really matters. And I think it's really important, if we're going to get absorbed in a story and care about the story, is that we have to judge the moral judgment of the fictionist. And so there has to be someone who has that moral judgment. And the moral judgment has to ultimately encourage altruism in the characters, in us caring about the characters, the fictionist, him or herself telling the story about those characters, and so on.
That's so interesting. So when we're reading a story, we're hearing about a story, watching a movie, even the narrator itself, is in it because the person,
Exactly.
they must have some stake in the story. Otherwise, why would they be
Exactly.
telling it? Interesting.
Exactly.
That's really interesting. What a lovely crescendo to finish the show on. William, thank you so much for coming on. Where can people find your book?
Amazon. Um, it's I think probably the easiest way. It was published by Harvard University Press. So if you're anti-Amazon, as very many people are, very many altruistic punishing readers who want to punish Jeff Bezos for all the bad things he's done. Harvard University Press. I think there are a lot of other places. I'm pretty sure it's on Kindle. It sort of has gone on and off Kindle, but that's Amazon again.
Right.
But uh, it's not you won't find it at your neighborhood bookstore very likely, but it's not that hard to get.
Beautiful. And when's your next book coming out?
Well, let me finish this first draft,
Yeah.
and then I'll let you know.
That'd be
But
good.
I'm hoping to finish it this year.
Beautiful. Because I'd love to do another show. And we talk about, I just had, I get a lot of philosophers on the show. We just had Kathleen Higgins on the shows from the University of Austin, Texas. And she just wrote a book
Nice.
about the aesthetics of grief and mourning from her own experiences of grief and mourning. And
I'll have to watch that.
yeah, yeah. And
Is
her
that
book,
is that up yet?
yes, it's already up. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
really
So you
interesting
sent me the
show.
link, so I'll look. Yeah.
No, I
Good.
definitely will. I definitely will. I think a lot of what you're speaking to, like, transmuting grief and mourning into art and, understanding of aesthetics and what that does as a way to sort of bring people into your experience. I think it's why people like yourself and myself love poetry and art and writing so much because it's this, they offer um, ways for empathy to ensue, I think, that almost no other domain can. You can speak about
Mhm.
something or you can feel something and then translate that, through art that is just so wonderfully human, I think. So,
Yes,
um,
exactly.
yeah,
Exactly.
well, William, thank you so much again. And
Well,
I'll
thank
talk to
you.
you soon,
This
I'm
is a real
sure.
pleasure.
Beautiful.
So,
Guys,
yeah.
as always, thank you so much for listening to the show, and I'll speak to you next week.